And I think it's a wonderful time for people to start wanting to read literature about China, and it's a fascinating country. Well, after the Cultural Revolution in 1978, China started to open up. So the first thing that came to China was actually books, Western books. And I remember there were times that you can go to some sort of outdoor market to buy the translated books. There'd be huge queues. That would be the first time in something like 10, 15 years that any Western books are sold in China. And that's how everything started. In a way, it is, funny enough. I think in the West, it has not been open to the Chinese literature or Chinese art, Chinese culture for a long time. And now because China is becoming more of an international power, and people are getting interested to know about that country, and this is happening. And there's a certain danger in the way that there is censorship. Being a writer means that you always write about human lives, and sometimes that is against certain state-controlled image, and so you always risk of going against the government. And for the writers in China, they all carry a certain degree of risk. Oh, I don't think of any format at all. When I write, I think of my characters, and I think them as individuals, flesh and blood, and I feel their emotions and their fears, and I put them down in my computer, and they come out in whatever format. But because I see them visually, and I see them living, walking, and exploring in Beijing, I think it comes through in the book that it's something of a visual effect. And of course, being Chinese, I write about food a lot, and that is a very visual thing for China. Yes, in fact, since I've been here for these 2 days, and a lot of people who've read the books, including filmmakers and radio journalists, have mentioned that the book seems to lend itself easily to film adaptation. I think it's great, because it's an easy read. It's something that people can easily understand. They can see and feel how things are in China. Oh, thank you. And that is one of the purposes, is you follow me and you go in a closed door, and inside that is this forbidden city, this mysterious city called Beijing, where the typical Chinese live behind those doors and with their family conflicts, etc. In some ways, it's correct. China is really going through what the West had gone through in the last 150 years in the period of, say, 20 years. So in that process, and all the problems that have happened since the Industrial Revolution is happening in China today. But fortunately, because we live in today's modern world, China is aware of environmental issues because Western countries make it aware. And then China is aware of social issues, the rich and poor gap. And there has been lessons that learned from Europe and America. So China is being made aware of that. And the country is trying to address that. There are lots of environmental initiatives now that are invested by foreign companies, foreign foundations to solve that problem. And so the problems are there. And hopefully, China wouldn't exactly repeat all the mistakes in exactly the same magnitude for exactly as long as it had happened here. I'm reading Henry James' The Golden Bowl.
From
Henry James.
It's an autobiography.
No, it's a novel.
A novel.
By an American author who's actually the most English writer there has ever been. It's a novel set in the 19th century England about obligations, sacrifice, and love. I grew up in a labor camp with my parents, and I was sent there, I think mostly because my parents were sent there by Mao and to be re-educated because they were intellectuals. And that was a term used in the Cultural Revolution for anyone who's had, for example, a college degree. I spent about 3 years in the remote mountain region of Sichuan province with my parents, and under very atrocious living conditions. Afterwards, I went back to Beijing. My mother took my sister and I back to Beijing, while my father had to go back to Shanghai, where he was born and where he grew up. Because in China, we had a hukou system. That meant a permission that you have from the government to live in a place. And normally one has to live and work in the place one is born. So my father, although had gone to university in Beijing, met my mother there and got married, had children, and he was not allowed to live in Beijing. It took him 12 years to gain permission from the government to move to Beijing and to live with us. And after that 12 years had passed, luckily, Mao Zedong died. He died in 1976. After he died, Deng Xiaoping came to power, who wisely reinstated universities. Universities were closed in the Cultural Revolution that began in 1966 for 10 years, because Mao had deemed university higher education being unnecessary and anti-revolutionary. So the youth of China was sent to farms, to people's commutes to be taught by peasants and learn to be farmhands. After universities were reinstated, the educational system went back into its normal operational mode. So I was able to go to Peking University in the 1980s. And during that time, I was very fortunate to have met a lot of people who were highly involved in the student democracy movement. Before 1989, China had gone through 2 periods, which you might not be aware of. And in the early 1980s, China had gone through a relatively liberating period of time, and from 1980 to 1986, and there was a rapid economic development in the very first stage, and the brand sort of open door policy that was introduced by Deng Xiaoping. And at that same time, there was also political liberation. The students were able to debate certain ideas that we found fascinating and novel, that we were able to read from newly translated foreign and Western literatures. And these ideas included democracy, liberty, and freedom. But in 1986, the chairman of the Communist Party, by the name of Hu Yaobang, who was sympathetic to the students' debate and democracy movement at that level, was stripped of his position and put under house arrest. And when that happened, China came into a relatively repressive period when all the debate had to go underground, and which caused a lot of tension, and that built up till the 1989, spring of 1989, when Hu Yaobang unexpectedly died of a heart attack. And that, as you all remember, was the event that triggered Tiananmen Square demonstrations. And the students wanted to go out to the street and demanded that they would be allowed to his funeral to say goodbye to someone who was sympathetic to the students. When that demand was refused, the students took to the streets, and it developed into a massive demonstration. And I was at Peking University at the time. I took part in the movement with lots of my friends, who some of them became very prominent in the movement and became student leaders and led hunger strikes, for example, and throughout the 7.5 weeks of the Tiananmen movement. when June 4th came, the tanks rode into Beijing and the army opened fire on the students. The movement was crushed. And after that, Beijing came under martial law, and the university campuses were sealed off. And there was a lot of arrests. There were executions, and it became a very dangerous place. And I had, before the Tiananmen event, earned a scholarship from the US to continue my graduate studies. So I was able to get my passport after I had been in hiding in the countryside for about a week. And once I had received my passport, I got my visa from the US consulate and left China on 2nd of August and to America. And I remember clearly, and still today, when I arrived in Williamsburg and I stood on the campus of William Mary, it was very quiet. It was an amazing and liberating feeling, and to be standing in a place where I realized for the first time in my life that no one was watching me and no one was going to report the things that I said.